very much, Harjun. And now I'll hand over to Mark, who I think has a slightly different perspective on things.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Hope so. Good. Okay, first thing to say is that my experience is limited to Africa here. So I don't speak from any knowledge of Eastern Europe or from Asia. So, and also that my experience is pretty much limited to working around sort of market-based sort of a systemic look at financial sector development through my work with Finmark Trust. So I don't consider myself to be a microfinance expert, and I suspect that Milford has reflected on microfinance for a lot longer and a lot deeper than I have. But I hope that I can offer some interesting perspectives on this. I suppose my issue with the book, and there are large parts of the book that I do agree with. Okay, my issue is not really so much about whether microfinance does or doesn't work, although that's obviously a rather important question. It's really about what role we should expect microfinance to play in a competitive, innovative, and diverse financial system, and therefore, what can we do collectively to create that competitiveness, innovation, and diversity of supply? So I feel that there is a role for microfinance, and it's a role that sits alongside other forms of financial service provision. And therefore, I am sort of disinclined, I think, to sweep away an entire asset class. But that's obviously something that we can debate. So yes, I happen to believe that microfinance does have a role to play in a multifaceted financial system that embraces not just microfinance institutions, but also banks, cooperatives, and other types of financial service provider. And I also think that microfinance can play an important and effective role. The issue so often with microfinance, and again, I speak particularly from an African perspective, although I suspect this is true of many other parts of the world as well, is that microfinance can work, but if you're lucky enough to live near a microfinance institution, and unfortunately the outreach of many microfinance institutions has been extremely poor. So one of the fundamental issues that I have slightly with Milford's book, and I slightly wonder whether it's a heady claim that he's making against microfinance in the way that he's criticizing the apologists for microfinance as making sort of heady claims, is that I think he overestimates the impact that microfinance has on an entire economy. And we had a little chat before. Nigeria is one example. For example, we had a chat about this. I mean, I simply, don't believe that it's Nigeria's sort of, recent adoption of microfinance that's caused the problems in Nigeria's economy. There are plenty of other things that cause Nigeria's problems, but microfinance isn't a big issue there. So it's not my role to critique the book, but I do want to just say that I think it's really beautifully written, and I think it and I don't mean that in any sort of patronizing sense. I do think it's really nice to read a book on financial sector development that provokes some kind of reaction at all, actually, whether you hate it or whether you love it. It's very passionately written, and so I definitely salute you for that. I think it comes at a very interesting time for microfinance generally. That we have a global financial crisis that I think is going to put the nail in the coffin of subsidized forms of microfinance anyway. There is just no more money to go around, and probably that's a good thing. Secondly, I think there are powerful, so in other words, the nature of supply, the landscape of supply is changing. There are powerful socio-economic trends that are changing the nature of supply and demand. So, you're seeing an emerging middle class whose needs are becoming more complex and frankly more attractive to, if you like, more mainstream providers of finance, including the banks. And the banks are then starting to see the logic of positioning themselves to capture that changing demand. We're obviously seeing new models of delivery based on new technology, particularly with the mobile phone, that are redefining the way financial services are provided anyway, which is very exciting. We're also seeing a lot of criticism of microfinance coming through from effectively an overexpansion and oversupply of microfinance, which has caused problems of market dysfunction and over-indebtedness as has been alluded to. And I think there's just good data and a more profound understanding of the impact of microfinance through books like Portfolios of the Poor, which Milford references in his book, which causes, I think, people at this stage to stand back and say, well, what is this all about? And I must say I was very struck by the CGAP focus note in January this year, which asked the question, does microcredit really help poor people? And I think it's pretty interesting to see, if you like, the global leader in information around microfinance asking that very question, and really questioning whether, some of the old myths about microfinance, people getting access to loans to help, micro enterprises, whether that really happens or not. And the point they're really making, which is coming through from the Portfolios of the Poor, is that no, they do believe that microfinance or microcredit has a role to play in helping people manage their financial lives, and I certainly think that's right in terms of the experience that I've seen. So I think Milford's absolutely right to be asking this question, and many other people are. But I just think there is some kind of role for sustainable microfinance in the future. I do have a little bit of a problem with the issue that, and I'm simplifying here, that microfinance has been used in a way as a substitute for coherent policies around SME development. I would simply argue I don't see why both can't exist. The fact that they don't coexist is not, I think, because of an excessive emphasis on microfinance. So I don't really buy the opportunity cost arguments. I suspect there probably is a certain amount, too much money spent on or directed towards microfinance, but I don't know that I really think it's a question of scarce resources that could have been put to much better use in other areas. We can debate that. I think my point here is that not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, and not everybody wants a formal job. So for these people, I think microfinance can surely be, a useful instrument. There's also a slight sense that there are models of best practice elsewhere in the world, whether it's northern Italy or whether it's Japan after the war or whatever, that can be imported into some markets that have been the recipients of microfinance, and those models would do a better job. And I think, if anything, if we've learned anything from the last 10 years or 15 years of development, is that what you don't want to do is to import models. You have to analyze that particular market for its particular issues and put in institutional changes to adapt to those particular market needs. So I'm skeptical about the import of some of those sorts of ideas, which is not to say, by the way, that I think intervention of some kind is not needed. I think very often at the sort of frontier of access, we do see a real need for intervention of one form or another. So I'm certainly not an ideologue for the sort of Washington consensus or anything like that. I just, again, from my experience in Africa, parastatal type interventions just have such a dismally bad track record that I would say that's just definitely not the way to go. And actually, in many parts of Africa, the cooperative model has also been extremely unsuccessful. I don't know what the reason is for that, but all I'm simply saying is that I think let's try and do what that market seems best suited to, rather than necessarily reach for solutions from elsewhere. I just return at this point to the issue that I raised at the beginning. The MFI outreach is really tiny in terms of the percentage of the population. In Rwanda, it's sort of 3% of the adult population uses MFIs. Tanzania, 7% of urban people use it, but only 1% of people in rural areas. These numbers are really tiny. And at the same time that there's been this emphasis on microfinance, actually, the banks have been slowly sort of plugging away, doing their own thing, and beginning to reach out to poorer people as well. Maybe those small percentages don't really matter if actually we're only interested in the people at the very margin. So maybe it doesn't really matter. But all I'm saying is that I think there are bigger stories to tell. And arguably, perhaps microfinance has sort of hogged a bit too much of the limelight, while other more interesting discussions are taking place. I think personally that with the right policy and other incentives, we will see formal financial institutions, by which I guess I particularly mean banks, playing a much bigger role in the future in delivering access to finance to increasing numbers of low-income people. And I just wanted to kind of perhaps touch on a couple of examples. One model is the basic bank account model, which has been used in South Africa. And I'm just giving you some sort of basic facts here. Between 2004 and 2008, 6 million basic no-frills bank accounts were opened in South Africa, roughly 2/3 by the private banking sector there and 1/3 by the Post Bank. And it contributed very substantially to the fact that banking access increased by 7 million people within that period. And 7 million people is an enormously large number. Basic bank accounts have been tried in Mexico, they've been tried in Pakistan, they've been tried in other markets in the world, and there's very little impact assessment about whether they've worked or not in those markets. But it is part of the sort of arsenal of policy-type interventions that can be used to get basic financial services to people. 72% of the people who took out those bank accounts had never had a bank account before, and 3/4 of them, by the time we did our research, were still active users. So churn was quite high, of course, but a lot of the churn was due to people actually moving up into different kinds of bank account as well. So I think basic bank accounts is one thing that I think policymakers can think about. The second model I just wanted to touch on very quickly is what you might call the equity bank model. An equity bank is by no means the only example here. You know, in its way, Capitec in South Africa could be seen as a little bit similar, although it comes from a slightly different background. The model here is different from a downscaling bank. The model here is a bank that's set up to analyse, understand, and serve the needs of a particular part of the low-income market. Equity Bank has just been enormously successful, as I'm sure many of you will know. It has increased its profits 20-fold in the last 6 years, and more than 40% of its current loan book is still described as being directed towards microcredits or SMEs. And by SMEs, it means SMEs rather than large SMEs, because that's a different category in its accounts. So yes, they are serving other kinds of people, and their profits are coming from a mix of different kinds of customer now, but they are still very heavily focused on a mass market. So that's when you establish an institution for a particular market. The third is the downscaler, which would be a large organisation that's looking to get into those smaller parts of the market, or large by number of people, but small by volume of profit. And I find that particularly interesting, because that speaks to the whole incentive of a large organisation that tries to, that's trying to trying to change the direction of the supertanker, and you're trying to say, despite the fact that my market's growing, I still want to go and tackle a particular part of the market that's low income and difficult. There are good examples of how downscaling has worked, and I think what we are beginning to see quite clearly is the coming together of microfinance as microfinance institutions go up versus the banks going down. One, ABSA in South Africa is another interesting example where, despite the fact that very large bank's profits grew at a compound growth rate of 23% in the first half of the last decade, 23% compound, year after year after year. Despite that, their mass market, in other words, their low-income market, started from zero at the beginning of that period and still managed to kick in about 5% of group profits at the end of that period. Now, that's a pretty formidable achievement and speaks to the sort of growth rates that you can get out of those kinds of markets. And the last sort of group, really, is that I just wanted to touch on quickly is the whole area of remote banking and branchless banking and remittances and so on. Clearly, we all know about M-Pesa, and the statistics are so extraordinary that I don't think they need to be repeated. But I'm simply holding that out as the sort of, as we all know, the kind of game changer in the world, where actually banks are now beginning to have to treat with the mobile operators in order to kind of forge new alliances that will, I think, have the potential to scoop up far more people than either banking on its own, or certainly than microfinance. So I certainly espouse a market-based approach here. I think questions do remain about that. And I think one of the questions is around political leadership, because I think this works in environments where there is strong political leadership around how you get profit-seeking companies to actually do things differently. And I think the development community, in my view, perhaps should arguably divert some of their resources from microfinance towards trying to create more of a sort of political will around different forms of market-led financial service delivery. Then the last point I just wanted to make, and here I guess Milford and I can agree, is that whether it's a microfinance institution that delivers the debt or a bank that delivers the debt, it is still debt at the end of the day. And for many small businesses, we do need to have some form of equity solution for some of these smaller organisations. Okay, equity can come in the form of a grant, I agree, but I'm not sure that's a great sort of message to be delivering, when times really are quite straitened at the moment. But I do think sort of more debate around micro venture capital, micro private equity is also what's needed, difficult though that might be.
Thanks.